And we're thrilled to kick off a webinar of our True Energy and Climate series. I'm joined by my co-leads. I'm Betty Cremens, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Kara and Jonathan. If you guys both want to just say hello.
Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Excellent. So we've been working hard to go through all of the responses that we received to the survey that we put out. So thank you all to everyone who participated. Lots of really great insights, lots of helpful information that's really guided our plans for the year. The plan that we've put forward is some short, medium, and long-term ideas. The first is the short-term ideas of running webinars every other month on a specific topic of interest nationwide on the topic of climate, energy, and national security, and we're thrilled to be kicking off the first one today. And then the original plan was to host follow-up dinners in each specific chapter region so that you could focus on and discuss within your own setting. However, currently that's probably not going to happen for the next few months. And here in San Francisco, we've been hosting happy hours, virtual happy hours. So if you're able to do that in your own chapter, we encourage you to host some virtual happy hours and talk through and contextualize some of the information that you hear about on the webinar. So let's hope that we can keep this as a national dialogue with regional and local conversations moving forward. We have plans about revisiting the energy training and the messaging guidance and how we're going to discuss on climate and energy at TrueCon, whenever that happens. So keep looking out for lots of information and lots of opportunities to feed in into the true energy and climate discussion throughout the year, and hopefully we can keep them going in a virtual context. So, things off today, we're joined by two true women. We have Stephanie Epner and Kate Guy, and they're joining us from Washington, D.C. and United Kingdom. So we're connecting many different time zones here. First, we're going to hear from Stephanie Epner, who's the founder and director of the Climate and Foreign Policy Project at the UN Foundation. She's going to give you the sort of 101 on climate and foreign policy. I'm going to flip it over to Kate Guy, who's a candidate at the University of Oxford, focusing on the intersection of climate and foreign policy. And Kate's going to take this a little further and tell us how climate impacts foreign policy and global security more broadly. And then, of course, we want your questions, your input, your ideas. This is a flowing fluid dialogue. So sure that you're thinking through what you want to ask these great true women, and let's get a conversation going between everybody. So first, I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie. While I'm pulling up your slides, maybe you want to introduce yourself a little more broadly and share a little bit about what you're working on right now.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, as Betty said, I hope you and all of your families are doing okay in light of this coronavirus pandemic. And I'm glad you chose to join us. Climate change, a cheerful distraction. But hopefully it is a good opportunity for us to discuss this other sort of looming crisis and what we can do. I think now in this political reality where finally there is an understanding, not only among Democrats, but among a growing number of Republicans too, that climate change is not just an environmental issue, but it's also a social issue, a public health issue, an economic issue, and yeah, of course, it's also a national security issue. And more people are understanding that, I think, and listing climate among the most serious threats that we're facing today. But I also find that climate change is among the most siloed issues in foreign policy. I was at the State Department for the last 4 years of the Obama administration, and I worked on basically every issue under the sun there. But I found that climate change was sort of in its own category. It had its own policy experts, sure, but also a unique group of journalists and members of Congress and publications and NGOs that paid attention to climate change. And it really has historically been a very walled off area of diplomacy and foreign relations. So the initiative that I started at the UN Foundation is aimed at closing that gap. And I work with foreign policy experts in a variety of different sectors to help them understand the links between climate change and the other issues that they work on. And that's a lot of what Kate will discuss in a few minutes. But I also find that for various reasons, a lot of people don't have a clear understanding of what international diplomacy on the climate crisis has looked like. We don't know what's in the Paris Agreement and where we are today. And so I thought we would start today's conversation. Before we get into the broader foreign policy implications of climate change, I'm going to give you a little climate diplomacy 101. It'll be quick, and happy to answer any questions after that. So first, there are a lot of misconceptions about the Paris Agreement. I think that's an understatement. Some people think also that this was sort of an agreement that was cooked up late one night by President Obama and his team. And the truth is that the Obama administration played a very important role, which I'll get to in a minute. But the negotiations that led to the Paris Agreement have been taking place for decades, back to 1992. And that's when the world came together in Rio de Janeiro and negotiated the UNFCCC, which is a mouthful of an acronym, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That basically, sorry, yeah, just leave it on this for a while, Betty. Betty's controlling my slides. This will be the main slide I use. Basically, the UNFCCC in 1992 says that the global community is going to come together and address climate change. Find a way to do that. That's when negotiations started shortly thereafter, and to eventually what became the Paris Agreement. But over the next 23 years, international negotiators tried to find different formulations of what could work for that, to organize that global effort. And there were two real sticking points in the international community, and they were one, participation, and two, ambition. So on one hand, you had some agreements be proposed that included all of the countries around the world, so max participation, but they didn't really require a whole lot from any of those countries, and they left entire flexibility. Everything was in countries' individual hands to decide what they would and wouldn't do. Nothing was really required. On the other hand, you had agreements. The other end of the spectrum is the Kyoto Protocol. So that was an agreement that did not have universality in terms of participation. It required only action from a small number of countries, or a relatively small number of countries, developed countries, including the United States. But it required a lot from them. It just left other countries, including notably China and some other massive developing countries, it left them without anything to do on this crisis. So it was an untenable position for the United States and for a few other countries as well. George Bush gets a lot of crap for overseeing the withdrawal of Kyoto, and some of that is warranted, but I think it would have been difficult for any president, Republican or Democrat, to stay in that agreement. There was a lot of opposition on Capitol Hill. So that formulation where you had a lot of ambition, legally binding targets, but not from all of the countries, that didn't work either. So the Paris Agreement eventually in 2015 is what is sort of the Goldilocks agreement. It's just right. So this slide here shows just some of the factors of the aspects of the agreement. So this is max inclusion, 196 parties, including the EU, to the agreement. And basically, all of those countries agreed to a global goal. And the goal is limiting the planet's warming to, quote, well below 2 degrees Celsius, which at the time was what scientists said was the critical kind of threshold. If warming went above 2 degrees, then we would see some really, really catastrophic implications on. So 196 parties agreed to do what they could to limit warming to well below 2 degrees. But importantly, each country has its own nationally determined target. What that means is every country can take a look at its own economics, the technology that's available to it, the energy access issues it may face, and those countries could determine for themselves what they could possibly do, the most ambitious target they could set for themselves toward that greater 2 degree goal. So then this global stocktake is an important part of the Paris Agreement. In 2023, that'll be the first time the world does this. Countries are supposed to do a stocktake. They're supposed to take and assess what they've done, the progress they've made towards their goals, and then the progress, of course, we've made collectively to that 2-degree goal. And then 2 years after that, so it's sort of like I'm trying to think of the right word. So it's 2023, 2 years after that, 2025, and then every 5 years from then on, 2 years after every global stock take is staggered, is what I was looking for. A staggered cycle. Countries are able to then put forward, based on that stock take, revised targets. So hopefully by then, 5 years later, technology will have evolved. There'll be a little bit more understanding of best practices, and countries can ratchet up their targets and get closer and closer to that 2-degree goal. So it's worth just pointing out right here that what is legally binding as a party to the Paris Agreement, you're committing to setting a national target, you're committing to doing the global stock take, and then theoretically you're invited to revise your target, but that's not essential, it's not required. What is not required is specific targets. No country is able to tell another country what it has to do. So it's really transparency. That is the spine of this agreement, is all based on transparency and mutual accountability. One other sort of misconception, or something the President Trump likes to criticize the agreement for, that I wanted to clarify. So the targets, the United States, as I said, could set its own targets. Legally, President Trump could have, instead of withdrawing from the agreement, change the targets, the United States targets. And again, they're not binding. There was nothing requiring him to meet Obama's targets. He could have changed the targets if that were the problem. He can't change China's targets, but then China is also allowed to set its own targets. So it's not that the agreement requires different things of the US or China or India or any other country. Each country decides from itself what it can do. The other thing, the criticism, is that even if every country met the target that it set in 2015 when the agreement was first negotiated, we still wouldn't be within that 2-degree threshold. Well, that's true, but as you can see from the staggered cycle, the stock take and then the revision, the stock take and then the revision, those initial targets were never meant to get us there all the way. They were meant to be the floor, and then hopefully technology evolves and we get tighter and tighter and closer to our goal over time. The last thing I just threw on this slide is this Green Climate Fund, just because that gets a lot of attention. It's actually not explicitly in the Paris Agreement. This is another area where President Trump has said the US has to pay X number of dollars. First of all, the US is not required to pay any number of dollars to the Green Climate Fund. What the Green Climate Fund is it was created in 2009, 2010. Developed countries are supposed to take a leading role in mobilizing a total of $100 billion a year annually starting this year in 2020. That's what countries agreed to do. It doesn't say which country is supposed to put forward which percentage of that. President Obama had committed $3 billion from the United States, but unfortunately we were only able to move $1 billion, and about 500 million of that billion came in the last days of the Obama administration. It wasn't in the budget that passed Congress, so we had to sort of move some things around. And so just again, this was a commitment President Obama made, but it's not something that is written into the Paris Agreement itself, that the US has to pay X number of dollars to the GCF. So, I mean, the last thing I'd just say about where we are today and the Paris Agreement. So the United States, as everyone I think knows, announced that it would withdraw. President Trump announced that in 2017 and then started the process of withdrawing last year. We're the only country that's done that. So that's the good news. No other country has followed the United States out the door. But what we've seen in the time since is just how essential the United States is to this system that's based on mutual accountability and mutual pressure. I've used this before, and it's a little bit stupid, but bear with me. It's like the role that the United States played in the Paris context is, I think about like when I go to the gym, which is not something that I do often, and not at all right now, I'm social distancing. But you know, I can listen to a really powerful playlist and look up some really inspiring quotes and get my head in the game and really have a good workout. But if I had a personal trainer there with me at the gym that was sort of yelling in my ear, telling me push harder, go faster, I would have a better workout. Someone who was telling me to adjust my form in certain ways and making sure that I get more out of every single step I'm taking, you get a better workout. And that's kind of the role the United States played. This was a priority in 2015, 2016. When I was working for Secretary Kerry, I can tell you it came up in all of his bilats, even, on the margins of like Syria negotiations, he was talking about Paris and about climate action. The world knew it was a priority for the president, and they knew that it would not, it wasn't like that they were going to get necessarily punished, but they knew that it would not go over well, that they had to be paying attention to this, they had to be following it, and that the United States was paying attention to what they were doing. And we deployed technical assistance. So that other aspect of the coach role, there was expertise on the ground to help them think through new formulations and ways that they could make their individual targets even more ambitious. So there was the sense of working together to get to the most ambitious agreement we could find. That's what's gone now. So the United States is out of the agreement, and no one stepped in to fill that coach role. Certainly the Chinese have not. It's kind of every country for itself at this point. As a result, our emissions have ticked back up. They decreased a little bit last year, but they're still up, and global emissions have done the same. And Betty, can you just go to the next slide? So this is a graph showing the global energy-related carbon emissions. And you can kind of see that it plateaus in 2015, 2016 global emissions around the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, and people hoped that it would go down. But then emissions start to tick back up in 2016, 2017. And the red line shows, based on policies that are announced already, that's where we're headed. And the green line is where we need to go. And this is a graph from the IEA. So the NPS, SDS, don't pay attention to those acronyms. Those are just part of this report that I stole this slide from right now, but I think it's a good visual representation. And just the last slide, the next one, is a good indication of where we are. So the United States, our emissions ticked up after President Trump was elected, and you can see that they decreased last year. But that's, we can get into it in the Q&A if people have questions. It's not all good news. Most sectors are still increasing their energy use and their emissions. The Climate Alliance of governors and subnational actors are doing all they can, but they're pushing an uphill battle, and the Trump administration is relaxing all kinds of signals, some standards, and even taking states and other actors to court over some of this stuff. So we're going to go in the right direction as we are going, but it won't be as accelerated as it needs to be if we continue down this path. And so I think that's where I'll stop for now in terms of the international context. I am happy to, in Q&A, get into a little bit more about the COP dynamics. The COP is the acronym for the UN climate negotiations. But, I've kind of set the stage with the foreign policy focused on climate change. But a lot of my work, and certainly Kate's work, is focused on, aside from the global effort to mitigate the climate threat, the reality is that some of the impacts are already here, and that foreign policy as it relates to climate change is not just about Paris. It's about so much more, because now the climate impacts are bleeding into so many other security challenges. So with that, I will turn it over to Kate to give a sense of what that means.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. Kate, let's go over to you, and maybe you can give us a quick introduction to yourself and your current work while I pull up your slides as well.
Sure, thanks. And I actually just put a link in the chat. Can we actually start there, because it ties into what Steph was just saying. Yeah, hey everyone. It is amazing to see all of your smiling faces and or names in this format. I think I know most of you. Those that I don't know and have come into Truman in the last few years, I was actually on staff and on the policy team, senior policy manager or something for a few years back at Truman, and just left in 2018 to come over here to the UK where I'm doing a PhD at Oxford in a lot of the things that I'm going to present now. So it's been really fun. It's sort of weird at this time, I think, to be over here and not be in the States, though still watching what's happening there and here in horror, kind of policy wise. So it doesn't look much brighter on this side of the pond, just a more intense lockdown as of last night. So what I'm going to kind of talk about and go over today is a report that I worked on for just about the past year at this point, with the Center for Climate and Security, which is, if you don't know it, a DC-based think tank that looks primarily at the intersection of climate change and national security, and has been for a long time producing really incredible research on, from the US context, what that intersection of issues looks like, as well as increasingly from a global context as well. And so that report, if you want to pull it up, is the Security Threat Assessment of Climate Change report. And you can find it at the Center for Climate and Security.org website. It should be right there on the front page. You can scroll down to it. It's nearly, I think, 100 pages, so I'll try to spare you from reading all of it, though if you have time and you want some other crazy global future crisis to read about, it will definitely get your mind off of coronavirus, though it won't make you any happier. Okay, so I think what Betty is pulling up right now, yeah, perfect. So
Okay, before you get started, I don't know that the link made it through on the chat.
oh, okay, I think Betty just pulled it up, actually.
Perfect.
See that? Yeah, okay, perfect. Sure, so
A screenshot. I don't trust sharing my browser. We're rolling with
that's
this.
smart. I don't want to share mine too many tabs. Okay, so what this is basically an extension of that last curve that Steph just showed, which is global emissions and really just global warming projections. So if at present we're at 2020, which is where that black line ends, and this is as of December 2019, so the data is not currently up to the moment, and it would look a little bit different at this moment, but just the projections are pretty good. And it's where we are on track for in terms of where our global emissions are. And while that line, the curve actually looks pretty good that Stephanie showed of US emissions, that's not the case for what's happening globally. Emissions are not only still continuing to rise, but they're still continuing to rise at a rate that, if we continue on that rate, leads to these levels of warming. So my 2100, the kind of baseline idea, if we did nothing, and if we did nothing from kind of this moment on forward, or if things got worse, if we started, trying to recover from a global recession or depression and burn a lot more dirty energy, which might currently happen, we would get somewhere within that gray bar, which is 4 to 4.8 degrees Celsius of warming. And then if we followed our current policies, that looks a little bit different, up to 3.2 degrees of warming. If we implement all of our pledges, all of the pledges made in the Paris Agreement at present, that would get us to about 2.5 to 2.8 degrees. So this is why Stephanie was saying it's so important to ratchet those targets up over time, because even that is not enough. And as has been pretty much acclaimed and agreed throughout the community in the last year and a half, really, is that even 2 degrees is probably too dangerous, and it's definitely too dangerous for some of the most vulnerable areas of the world. So what we're trying to get to now is not a 2-degree future, it's a 1.5-degree future, and that is, what those those green and yellow bars look like. And for reference, I'm going to talk all in Celsius now, because the Fahrenheit conversions are really wonky and I always forget them. But in Celsius terms, we are about 1 degree Celsius of warming at present. So everything you see here, from crazy fires in Australia and California to more intense storms to the rapidly melting Arctic and Antarctic, is all happening just at 1 degree warming. And you would hope, or not hope, but you would think that maybe with each increasing degree of warming, that is a nice, gentle, hopefully, curve going up. But it's not. The small numbers are quite innocuous, and it might even be, those crazy exponential curves that you see with coronavirus. That's what the destruction looks like as you increase up that scale. So what does that look like? Okay, you can go to, to my slides now. I find it's always really difficult discussing in temperatures and especially emissions projections because you don't really know what they mean. You don't really have a feel for what they are. And that's exactly what we set out to do in this report. So it was a group of mostly former, but some current national security, military, and intelligence leaders who have been doing threat assessments and security policy work for decades that the center brought together and said, we need to look really seriously at future scenarios of warming to see what exactly they mean from a security perspective. Because I don't know, most of you at this point are probably familiar with climate change is a national security issue. I think that we've especially at Truman have been singing that song for a very long time. But what there is a lack of is detail, and detail of where and how and why and who's affected and whose interests are affected. And there's frankly even some speculation that, oh, maybe this will be good for some countries. Maybe some countries will be winners and some will be losers, or some parts of the world will be affected in a slightly beneficial way, and da 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 da, right? So what you really do have to do is a pretty intense effort to scope out different futures as the intelligence world does, and really say under different scenarios what happens. And so that's what this report was seeking to do. So the scope of it, once we got this group together, you can stay on the first slide for a while, Betty. Yeah, sorry. Don't want to show you guys all the good stuff before I get there. So what the scope of the report was, if you wanted to do a scenario-based analysis of climate change and the effects of climate change on security specifically, it really is different depending upon which scenario of warming you're looking at. So what we did was say, okay, let's focus on 2 scenarios of warming, future scenarios. So kind of disregarding even what's happening right now, and say, what does the world look like? What do security interests, global security interests broadly look like in a 1 to 2 degree scenario? And given what we're on track for, that would roughly get us to mid-century. So what do things look like for the next 30 years if we continue to let emissions rise up to 2 degrees, which is the soonest we could hit that threshold? So that's the first scenario. The second scenario is the second half of the century. So what happens if we continue on that track and let things rise 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, or even beyond 4 degrees, which could happen in that second half of the century by 2100. And these are huge timeframes. I understand it's especially hard for, I think, the security world, and especially, if you've ever worked within security planning at DoD, 30 years is a long-term timeframe, right? But the impacts are so intense, and the actions that you need to prevent them are so literally right now that it bears very much importance to look at a pretty long-term scenario. So we came up with those scenarios and then tried to follow, to the best of the ability of the group, a strict threat assessment methodology, not technology, because there's no good technology here, but methodology, so that each scenario is assessed on some scale of severity. So that's what you'll find within the report. And it was a great team of IC folks and people that worked for the NIC and made the global trends reports and things like that to help us get there. And what we ended up doing was looking at every region of the world in both scenarios and trying to assess what are the impacts. We divided those up by the US combatant commands just to make it easy for folks that are generally looking at this kind of information. And we also did a final kind of global intersecting risk analysis as well. So it's easy to kind of look at PACOM or look at CENTCOM and say, what are the impacts within this region? But as we know, as we're seeing each day, a lot of different risks can intersect at the international level and make things worse. So we looked at each region of the world, both scenarios, and we said, how do these scenarios impact security institutions, environments, and infrastructure? Kind of looking at those 3 different bounds. And then within each of those bounds, assessing what does that look like? And also, for good measure, the first chapter of the report is an overview of climate security more broadly. And if people can mute, that would be awesome. Thanks. So that first chapter, if any of you are interested or new to the field or curious, what is this climate security topic even about? It breaks it down. It breaks the existing literature up to date into kind of how you can think about the intersection of national security and the climate shocks that we are expecting will come as climate change gets worse and more intense. And those are really two big categories. So the first is the security effects of physical shocks themselves. So from a storm, this picture on the screen is from one of the huge hurricanes that hit Florida in recent years, and the National Guard having to respond. Obviously, that's a huge security impact. And sea level rise being another, fires being another, and just extreme weather, food, water, and general resource scarcity and stress and strain, and other physical shocks that together will have huge security and stability implications as they get more and more intense. So that's one bucket. The second bucket are social tensions that come on the back of those physical shocks. So it could be, you could withstand, one really bad flood year, but could a community, an already fragile government withstand 5 really bad flood years? What happens to migration patterns? What happens to the nationalistic responses to migration as people adapt and move out of places that are impacted by climate change? So I encourage you, if you're just looking for a quick part to read, they're pretty concise summaries that can just get you up to speed on how climate impacts the security in a wide range of thematic areas. So in that climate security nexus chapter. But what you're here for probably is not not the fun literature assessments and summaries, but instead, what does the world look like? So let's go to the next slide, Betty. So when you look at that first scenario of warming, so this is near term, getting us to mid-century, at each combatant command, it's even at this low level of warming, or 2 degrees, quote, safe level of warming, things are pretty bad. And this is different depending upon in which region you are. And this is one of the main findings of the report, and something that bared out as our hypotheses expected them to, is at the lowest levels of warming. So now, in the next few years, the most vulnerable regions of the world are hit the worst. And it's just the most kind of unlucky element of the climate crisis, I think, is that the regions that are already more poor around the equator have instability and recent histories of conflict, and were probably the least to blame for historic global emissions, are the ones that in the near term are hit the worst. So that's places like the Middle East, that's places like the Sahel region around Africa, or frankly, all of Africa. But that's also heavily populated, low-lying cities in Southeast Asia. That's also the Golden Triangle in Central America, where you're seeing crop failures already lead to increased crime and organized crime in those areas, and migration out of these areas. So I think it's really important, especially for the security folks on this call, that if you're already working in an area where there is instability or conflict or resource stress or those kind of things, the data bears out and the models bear out that those are going to get worse pretty quickly. So if you're making plans or making even development responses to the current situation, that's not enough. You need to be planning for the shocks that are coming, and then the shocks that are increasing with intensity and frequency. And that's different for each region, and you can kind of dive into what those shocks look like, but they're what you would expect. And they're increased drought or just increased weather variability, right? So you might get a lot of rain in huge heavy doses following on a drought that leads to intense flooding, intense washing away of existing kind of soil, mudslides, things like that. And then the security impacts of that are people moving around in much larger quantities and much faster. So I think a lot of the climate migration, especially at lower levels of warming, that people imagine is that a bunch of people are going to leave Africa or leave the Middle East and come into Europe like they tried to do in the Syrian migration crisis in 2015. But actually, kind of more destabilizing than that are groups moving around near to where they already are. So this is what you're seeing in the Sahel region or in the Lake Chad region, where groups that can no longer be sustained where they were are moving into cities and putting increasing strain on those cities. Or herders and agricultural pastoral farmers are coming into contact. And that's where you see those local level conflicts kind of burst up and emerge in places where there are already tensions or already lack of governance or things like that. And I think we are starting to see already more and more of those kind of hotspots emerge. And there's great work. I know that Ashley Moran, another Truman member, has done, actually looking into those hotspots and seeing where do state fragility and climate risk overlap. And it's generally in these really vulnerable areas. But let me say, for those of us that don't live in those areas and live in the West or in the northern industrialized countries, it's not pretty for us either at this low level of warming. And we will also, in the US, in Europe, across to the region of China or Canada, have increasingly extreme weather, increasingly extreme payments upon ourselves and upon our governments to try to bail people out from that weather, be it coastal regions and sea level rise, flooding very expensive cities or very expensive real estate, to increasingly intense food stress, agricultural stress, and drying out of regions that are already pretty dry in the US or in Europe. And what are we going to do when those things are happening? How do our societies kind of deal with that increasingly stressful reality of people having to leave the places they've lived for a really long time and move to new careers or move whole agricultural districts, things like that. So this is, again, a near-term scenario of warming, and one that we are solidly on track for, are already in, frankly, and kind of looks like good if we're able to contain and constrain our emissions. So if we go to the next slide, this is what the end of the century looks like, or the later half of the century looks like. Again, fully on track for this reality. So everywhere in the world would see high to catastrophic levels of security risk. And those are, very big words, but these are intelligence analysts saying them. So I think it's worth listening to them. And this is just because at this level of warming, not only will you see just crazy levels of those physical shocks, which I was talking about, but also the likely collapse of societies, of states, of places where there was good governance before, which can no longer handle the strain of extreme water stress or intense drought. The Middle East at this level of warming, in some places in Africa, are unlivable. It's not just that they are very hot and you need to kind of increase your ability to handle that. It's that people will die or go into severe heat stroke if they're outside for longer than 10 minutes, right? So what happens to whole regions of the world at that level of warming? And much like on the earlier scenario, some of these regions that are facing those very, very bleak realities, they're not just islands, right? They're not just the Pacific Islands, who are often in our mind as really kind of at risk from losing their homes. These are some of the most densely populated cities and regions in the world. This is Southeast Asia, this is Bangladesh, this is Palestine, which has skyrocketing population with each year. And we kind of know where we're headed in these areas, and people are only kind of increasing the strain that their governments will have to deal with at that time, 30 years from now. And these are the scenarios where, for Europe, for North America, the institutional stress will just be so unlike anything we've ever seen before, or maybe much like what we're seeing now. It's hard to know. But what happens when the European Union itself might break apart because it can no longer withstand the shocks that so much of the countries are seeing? And we're already seeing trends of this, of course, but add just a little bit of climate fuel to these fires, to these ethno-nationalist responses, to the kind of blame game that happens among countries when when one country doesn't want to bail out another country for some effect that has reached its shores. That's where you start to see breakdown in liberal international order, in democratic principles. This is an intersection of issues that I'm really interested in, is how do authoritarian governments and places like China or places like Saudi Arabia or backsliding democracies kind of take these climate shocks and respond to them. It might be in a good way, good. It might be in a way of restoring order quickly, but it might be in a way that is not upholding people's human rights and kind of making utilitarian judgments of who gets to live and who has to move and who has livelihood stripped from them and all of those kind of things. So that's where some of these institutional responses kind of interact. And then, of course, at this level, the infrastructure that we have just cannot withstand this level of global average warming. Our biggest kind of military bases from a US perspective, many are on the coast, many are in dry areas, would have to fundamentally be changed from a technological point of view or moved in order to get them to areas that are able to withstand these kind of shocks. And absolutely our posture around the world would also, I mean, given any region that you want to select, how are we maintaining stability in those regions where it's already difficult, frankly, for our troops to maintain stability? And I think increasingly in this scenario, the question becomes, do we want to? Do we retreat? Do we kind of blend into the America First ideas of no longer kind of being the policeman for the world when the collapse of the world is this intense? And what does that mean for us? What does that mean for US interests if we're no longer able to provide stability in regions of the world that depend on them? I think that is an open question. So yeah, those are kind of the high level looks. I encourage you kind of within each region of the world, if there's a particular region you're interested in diving into it. Each is just a summary of the latest both climate literature as well as security literature, because as Steph was saying, because climate has been so siloed for so long, there is a lack of really interesting and really integrated security analyses of how these environmental changes will interact with security problems that we already have. So it's trying to really marry those two together and provide a picture for where the world is going. Now, if you go to the final slide, I'll just wrap up with this, which are some recommendations, which are actually from a perspective of the security community, quite bold, because never have you actually had a group like this of, as I said, former military leaders, generals, ambassadors, high-ranking officials come out and argue for some sort of climate mitigation policy. But the results of this kind of study are just so stark that it's very clear that the only thing that is risk averse in a situation like this, the only policy that you could go forward with is one of climate mitigation. So the recommendations that this, again, security group puts forward are achieving net zero global emissions as soon as possible. So that's bending that curve, not the coronavirus curve, but the climate curve down to levels of as safe warming as we can possibly get. Now, an important caveat to that, because there's a lot of net zero talk going around, I think, is that bending that curve needs to be done in a way that is, yes, ambitious, but also safe and as equitable as we can make it, and well governed. Because if we get to mid-century and we're seeing we're still on that trajectory, and people start using wildly untested geoengineering technologies, or each country and nation tries to mess with its own weather in certain ways to help it, that is not necessarily going to, those frankly pose new security risks and are really interesting if we want to talk about them. The second two recommendations are things that the security community ourselves can do. So making sure that we are climate proofing the environments, infrastructure, institutions, systems, anything that you are building or you are part of building from a security perspective should be done with these future scenarios in mind. Because as I said, we are on track for them. And change is weirdly the new normal. And so if you're not building things to be resilient to what the models tell us are coming, you are building things out of date. And then the last recommendation is one that the presidential candidates have done a pretty good job of, I would say, in this cycle, but needs to be done a lot more, which is communicating these kind of threats as high level, high ranking security threats and prioritizing them as such. So reorganizing systems within DoD, within NSC, within state even to better understand the integrated nature of these threats across, as Stephanie has showed us, all areas of foreign policy and not keeping them in their silos. Because without that, we will be blind to a huge dimension of security threat that's interacting with all of our other interests. So, okay, I think I'm going to stop there and hopefully we can open up to a good discussion. But thanks, and sorry to depress you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Kate, for providing us with very concrete and very stark and stoic, but still inspiring comments and remarks in the midst of the world we're living in now. So thank you. I've learned so much on this from both of your presentations. I know we keep asking you to mute yourselves, but now's the time to unmute. We have just over 10 minutes. So I could ask you questions all day, but I want to open it up. Who has a question for Kate and or Stephanie or a dialogue? Yes, please go ahead.
I don't know if that's me that I'm getting. Hold on. Hi, this is Xander Mize. Nice to see everybody. My question is, if you could change one thing about current U.S. policy, what would the one thing be in this, let's say, next fiscal year? And I guess we have, with COVID, yes, I understand that might change stuff, but if you could, in a perfect world, pick one thing to change, what would be the top priority for you policy-wise?
And that's a tough one, but I think the biggest hurdle that I see to progress is the politicization. This is not a direct answer to your question, but I do think that the more, politicize this issue is, the longer it's going to take us to have an enduring solution here, or policies that will endure from one administration to the next. With that said, I think maybe for me, this is kind of a cop-out, but a price on carbon is kind of an area to start, where there's a lot of thinking, a lot of proposals out there, a lot of debate to be had, to be sure, but a way to get, I think, Democrats and Republicans, at least starting to get on a similar page about how to confront this. And I think that's really an important part of this.
Yeah, and for me, I think that absolutely on the mitigation side, so how we prevent these problems is the only way to go probably at this point, save a humongous Green New Deal. But I think from the other perspective of how do we start adapting to these risks and preserving resilience and preserving US leadership, especially security leadership in these kind of futures, is really prioritizing it like one. And teaching security professionals that it's not just the siloed, forget about greenie issue anymore. It's one that's interacting with all of their issues. And from people within the Obama administration on the kind of DoD side or the NSC side, the rhetoric was right, but the reorganization was not necessarily able to change things enough that the infrastructure and the deep kind of expertise of the security community was taking it seriously. And so that is something that, you don't even need, you just need a good president. You don't necessarily need congressional approval to restructure and reorient those systems to elevate it in priority. So hopefully that's an easier fix.
Thank you.
Jump in with questions. Don't wait for me to call on you.
Hi, this is Juan Palaso. Quick question. Does anybody have any, expertise on discussing economics of emergent infectious disease, meaning COVID-19, with an environmental angle?
Yeah, so this is something actually the Lancet, the biggest medical journal, has been tracking for a long time, for many years now, of kind of how climate change interacts with health risks broadly. So infectious diseases being one of them, but there are many other health risks, unfortunately, that are associated with climate change and will only get worse. So there is really good work that's being done on it. I think that you'll probably see more of that just in response to COVID, because again, these are things we can see see coming, but it's everything from increased spread of Lyme disease within the United States to cholera and malaria and some of those vector-borne diseases having wider spread regions, so that they can, and Zika and things like that, so they can go further when the temperatures are warmer, and the winters are less harsh to kind of kill off some of those vectors. So I'd point you towards the Lancet climate work to really be steered in the health direction.
Another great resource is the Harvard, the name of the center, but they have a center on the environment and public health that Gina McCarthy took over when she left EPA and actually really focused it heavily on climate and public health. And they've done some really excellent research as well. They have a lot of resources on their website if you want to take a look at that too. But as Kate mentioned, it's also getting a ton of attention in climate circles, and I suspect we'll see a lot of literature in the weeks and months ahead too.
Hi everyone, this is Mintu Sam. Thanks so much for this. First, can we share the slides that you were just talking through? I'm on a phone, so I didn't get to see them, and would be great to just and obviously we'll ask you for permission if we're going to use them in any way, but just wondering if you could send that around. And then second, just with COVID-19 now and the, flights being delayed and people staying in and all of this, I was just listening in a Freakonomics podcast about the impact that the sort of silver lining, if there is any at all, in this is the reduction in emissions just while we're trying to isolate and deal with this. And sort of similarly, they looked at what happened before the Beijing Olympics and the 2-month period of time when the Chinese government cracked down on pollution and the impact that had, not just in terms of health outcomes and air pollution, but emissions and all, carbon emissions and all the rest of it. So just wondering, if you, this is more kind of a conversation starter maybe for another time, but just thinking through the impact that's having on people's lives and sort of realizing that in a new climate future, this may become more normal, where at some points we may have to just shut down our lives so that we can mitigate some of the emissions impacts. And wondering if you've heard anything more about that, if anyone's sort of looked into some of this and how that might maybe jumpstart public opinion about doing something about this before we get to a point where this becomes a reality to mitigate climate. Thanks.
Yeah, I think so. There are sort of, I think people are trying to understand the larger implications for the fight against climate change. Certainly emissions are decreasing, but I think there's reason to believe as well that the ramifications when countries around the world are starting to figure out economic recovery, and you're already seeing China kind of pointing to its need to restart its economy, to back away from some of its clean energy plans, that it'll be harder just also for businesses of all sides to, I don't know, Betty, if you have thoughts on this. This goes into some of your work, but there'll be implications down the road. The economic hit, this was a key reason why climate action was sort of stalled in 2008, and there is a fear that it will be stalled again. Hopefully there will be opportunities to build in some sustainable development into the recovery that we attempt after this. But it is interesting to see, and interesting, like the World Bank, I believe they canceled certainly their spring meeting this year, but I believe they actually canceled it indefinitely and just said, it's not worth the emissions to have this meeting in person every single year, and for other reasons as well. But emissions is one of the things that they cited. So there will be hopefully some new, maybe that's a silver lining. I hate to find any sort of in this at all, but maybe that's something that can come out of it, some new strategies. But overall, I think it's going to slow down, unfortunately, the climate effort, absent some serious advocacy at work and some good leaders coming to the forefront.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I think it's hard because at the climate community right now, so many people are like, oh, this is good for climate. Global emissions will be down this year, which is true. Global emissions will be down this year. But you better believe that China and India, which is now in lockdown, after this is passed, will be having their every single coal-fired power plant that had been on the path to decommission or not working fired up. And not even if they need them, but just to promote economic activity. And that is really not the direction we need to go in. But I hear you into on the behavioral change point. I think there maybe is something there. I mean, we now all have Zoom in our computers, and I know especially within the academic community, it's made a lot of people think twice about the conferences they go to and if they really need to go to them. And if we could just be doing it via Zoom.
Yep.
But it also probably shows the problems with that, the economic cost of rationing or of turning off sectors of the economy, like some of the activist wing are increasingly calling for, of banning all air travel. Well, obviously we now see that would be a big problem. So it kind of makes the fault lines even more stark, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah, if I can call on moderator privilege and just share, I think that we need to look at emissions across all sectors of the economy. And so while transport emissions are indeed down right now, they represent about 10 to 12% of global emissions. And everyone's saying, oh, well, airlines are stopped, so therefore we're on the right trajectory. But aviation is only about 2% of global emissions. So, that's just one piece of the pie. Electricity demand is still pretty high. Agricultural and land use changes are about 25% of global emissions, and we're all still eating lots of food. So I think and then there's industrial emissions, as Kate and Stephanie were both talking about, and those might be temporarily down, but then will spike. So I think it's worth looking across all sectors of emissions, and looking at how the trajectory and the recovery can begin to put us on better track moving forward. But yeah, just stopping airlines is not going to help us solve climate change. It's just one piece of the pie. So unfortunately, we're at time. If we have one final question, maybe we can sneak that in. If there's any burning questions out there. All right. I think with that, we're gonna wrap this right on time. Thanking both Stephanie and Kate for really inspiring and thoughtful and data rich, but still inspiring presentations. Thank you both so much for coming online in the midst of the coronavirus to share really important work and make sure that we're all keeping our focus on big systemic matters that really address big important issues that each of us are uniquely qualified to integrate into our own work, no matter what topic you work on, in order to help us bend the curve moving forward in multiple ways. So we'll make sure that you have links to all the documents and resources shared. Both Stephanie and Kate were on the email chain of invitations. If you have follow-up questions for them, I'm going to volunteer their Gmails to be available. And we'll keep doing this every other month. So hopefully many more of you will join us as presenters on your own unique topics to start really exciting conversations. So with that, thank you all. Be safe, be well, be healthy. All my best to all of your families. Make sure you wash your hands after this. And thank you all. We'll see you in a few months.
Thank you, Betty.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Everybody, take care.